All right, today I'm going to be talking about ethical issues in behavioral research. Basically, before anyone conducts research, you want to spend some time thinking about possible ethical issues related to your research and your research design. Are you protecting participants the best way you possibly can? Are you protecting their data? Is the design of the study such that you're trying to minimize stress or eliminate stress if it isn't necessary to your design? Basically trying to treat your participants as, as the best way you possibly can. So what we'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the history of ethical research or ethical issues in research. We'll talk about some of the protections that are kind of in place for participants, talk about deception a little bit, and then some different forms of unethical behavior by researchers. So some of the major influences on the legal restrictions currently for conducting research, some of the earliest restrictions go back to something called the Nuremberg Code. And this goes back to the 1940s. The Nuremberg Code was a set of guidelines set out for researchers, especially medical researchers. And this grew out of the Nuremberg trial. And the Nuremberg trials were where Nazi war criminals were put on trial for their crimes, including doctors working for the Nazis who performed horrible experiments on prisoners in the concentration camps without their consent, obviously. They didn't want to participate, they were forced to. And so the Nuremberg Code set out ethical guidelines for especially medical research. And some real basic things like informed consent, requiring that the participant kind of volunteer or give consent to participate in medical research. And this idea of trying to do no harm, not purposely just trying to harm someone with no benefit to that person. In the United States, then, there was a study that ran for 40 years in Tuskegee. And this study basically it was medical research again, wanting to know what the long-term effects of syphilis were. And they were studying African American men who had contracted syphilis. And this was unethical in multiple ways. The first thing they did is they deceived the participants and misled them about what they had. They didn't tell them they had syphilis. They called it bad blood and kind of just left it at that. So the African American men didn't really know what the problem was. In addition, the men that were recruited for the study were told they'd be given free health care. And it was kind of implied that they were receiving treatment for their bad blood, when in fact, at the time the study started, there was no effective treatment for syphilis. And so they weren't giving them any treatment to help them. And in fact, years later, kind of in the middle of the study, penicillin came along as being an effective treatment for syphilis. That treatment was withheld from these men, even though it would have kind of resolved their issues or helped them. And so this is after, it started before, but it continued after the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code should have outlawed a lot of this research, but they continued this research. So they deceived the participants, they withheld treatment, which is probably the worst part of this, and basically followed these men until they died. And it wasn't until years later President Clinton actually offered an official apology to the families. I think there were some survivors of the Tuskegee study. And then within psychology, we have the Milgram series of studies on obedience, where Milgram's manipulating different variables, but the basic setup is the same, where there's a teacher and a learner. The teacher is the real participant in the study. the learner is actually a confederate working for the researcher. And they're supposedly the teacher's going to teach the learner a series of word pairs. And then later, the teacher's going to say one half of the word pair, and the learner has to try to say the second half from memory. But then there's this shock generator. They hook the learner up to a shock generator, and each time they get an answer incorrect, the teacher has to flip a switch to deliver an electric shock. Now, no electric shocks were actually delivered, but the teacher doesn't know that. They believe that electric shocks are being delivered. And if you've ever seen the original footage, the clips, the shock generator, the whole setup's very realistic. And they have to keep increasing the voltage of those shocks each time the learner gets something wrong. And the ethical issue here is that it put the participants or the teachers through immense stress. Like I said, if you ever have a chance to see the original footage, they're sweating, they're shaking, they're kind of laughing nervously. They're very stressed in this study. And so that was the concern here is that it did involve deception, but debriefing kind of removed or kind of helped deal with a lot of the deception issues. The main ethical issue was the amount of stress that participants were under. And the question is, did the amount of stress that participants were under, is that balanced out, or is that weighed less than the amount of good that came out of this study? And that's debatable. I mean, on the one hand, up until that point, we didn't really know people would be willing to harm another person just because an authority figure was kind of telling them to. In fact, Milgram, before he started that research, he asked psychologists, psychiatrists, college students to estimate what percentage of participants would continue to shock the learner all the way to the end, to 450 volts. And the experts, the college students, the psychologists all estimated between, maybe 1% and 2% would go all the way to the end. Well, Milgram actually found basically just the worst people would go to the end. That was it. But Milgram found that 65% of people would go to the end. So he really was giving us new information. But the question is, did you really have to put people through that much stress to get that information? So these are kind of the sources, these kind of unethical studies, these are the sources of our current ethical guidelines. And so who is protecting participants today? Where are ethical guidelines coming from to kind of help protect participants? First of all, in psychology, there's a couple different national professional organizations. There's the APA and the APS, and they each have their own ethical guidelines for researchers to follow. The APA is kind of a blend. It's a blend of psychologists that do research, but there's also a heavy emphasis on practice. And so therapy is a big emphasis of the APA. And so their ethical guidelines are not only for researchers, but also for therapists in how to conduct ethical therapy. And so you can see that some of these sections relate to researchers, some to therapists. So the therapy section, that doesn't pertain to researchers unless if you're doing research on therapy, potentially. Keeping fees, privacy, confidentiality, competence, those sorts of things. If we just go down to research and publication, you're going to see a lot of the issues that were discussed in your textbook. So IRB approval, informed consent, and then there's lots of little points here about when you need informed consent, when you don't, maybe when you need more than just informed consent, guidelines related to deception and debriefing, non-human animal use, how to report results, those sorts of things. And I don't know if they do this anymore, but the APA specifically, they have one publication called the APA Monitor, and their end of the year issue, they used to publish the names and the reasons for psychologists who had violated ethical guidelines during that year. So whether it was related to therapy or retractions related to publications because of fake data or problems with data or whatever. So it's kind of like a public shaming. So the first layer of protection here are professional organizations. In addition, a lot of psychologists who are conducting research work for universities. And if the university is publicly funded or the research is publicly funded, it has to go through, if it's human-based, it has to go through something called an IRB, which is an institutional review board. And the institutional review board basically consists of several members from the university. Some are faculty in science departments. So you might have someone in there from physics or biology, psychology. We've had someone on there before. But you also have faculty from non-science departments. So maybe someone from English or history. And it's the balance there. You want the non-science folks in there to kind of keep the scientific researchers in line, to make sure that maybe they're overlooking some problems with the research that a non-scientific faculty member might see. Related to that, there's also always at least one outside member, one person outside of the university that's also a member of the IRB. So this is a member of the community. In the past, UW's IRB, we've had, I think, a physician on there. And so you've got people from different backgrounds to hopefully be able to detect any potential problems with the research in terms of ethics or the protection of participants. And so any research that a faculty member or a student wants to conduct at the university has to go through this IRB process, has to be approved. This is one of the reasons why your research projects for this class, they can only be kind of limited in scope. It's because I've already had to submit an IRB to get kind of general projects that typically get run in this class approved. And in doing that, I've had to make certain concessions. So this is why you can't do research on sexual behavior, on drug use, any of those things that might get us into places where the IRB wouldn't approve that research for class use. So this is why your class projects are somewhat restricted in what you can and can't do. If you were doing research, let's say for a senior thesis or something under supervision of a faculty member, you'd also have to go through this IRB process to get your specific study approved before you can start running it. And part of university guidelines, most universities I think anymore, is something called CITI training. And this stands for, I think it's Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative, something like that is what CITI training stands for. And CITI training, basically what it's doing is, after the Tuskegee study, there was a group of scientists and ethicists that got together that kind of created another round of ethical guidelines that researchers should follow. And this was called the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report, the gist of it is basically the things that you've read about and we've talked about. It's things like informed consent, debriefing, trying to minimize deception unless if it's absolutely necessary, protecting the data, protecting the rights of the participants, these sorts of things. And so CITI training, actually go here. Actually look up the name here. So it's Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative. And so there's actually courses on here. If you're the primary researcher, so you're the faculty member, every several years you have to go back through and renew your city training, basically. And it tests you over some of the tenets of the Belmont Report, things like informed consent, when it's necessary, when it may not be necessary, deception, how you treat participants, those sorts of things. It's also, though, required even of individuals who are running participants. Anybody who comes into contact with the participants in the research, so it could be graduate students, it could be undergraduate students working in a lab, they also have to do kind of a shortened version of the city training to make sure that they understand ethical research. Okay, so as part of the university guidelines, you have to go through an IRB that has to approve the research. You have to go through and pass city training to show that you understand how to run research ethically. If you're conducting non-human animal research, instead of going through an IRB, you go through an IACUC. This is Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. It's basically an IRB for non-human animals. So if I want to run research on rats or baboons or whatever, I would have to get my research approved through the IACUC. Once again, they're set up just to try to minimize the amount of harm that's going to be done to the animals. And typically part of conducting animal research, one requirement is that all participants who are coming into contact with the animals have to undergo specialized training. You also typically have to have a veterinarian on staff that periodically checks the health of the animals. And obviously we go through IRBs, we go through city training to prevent stuff like this happening, to prevent unethical research. All right, I'm not going to go through these in detail because I think your book does a great job explaining these. Informed consent, debriefing, right to privacy. I will mention here with debriefing, I think a lot of the satisfaction that participants get out of a study, whether they actually enjoyed it and thought it was important or whether they just thought it was a waste of time, I think a lot of what participants take away comes out of debriefing. If you do a good job debriefing, if you convey that, you thank the participant for their help, you ask them if they have any questions, you maybe ask for their response to certain parts of the study to make sure they understood directions or if there was anything that was confusing to them. And once again, just kind of convey this respect. I think participants leave that study being satisfied with their experience. Debriefing is especially important if your research involved deception. You want to make sure you explain in detail why that deception was used, why it was necessary. And if you do that in a respectful way, I think most participants are okay with it. And then right to privacy, making sure that you're protecting data, you're not sharing data. And this can either be anonymous data where you can't connect the participant's name to their data, which I think a lot of research in psychology, in the psychology department, kind of is anonymous. And then more confidential research where technically you can match names with data, but you're not going to give that information to anybody outside of the research group. You're not, running down the hallway after you've conducted your research on prejudice saying, hey, guess which student is really prejudiced. You're protecting that information. If you have any questions on those three components, please make sure you ask me at some point. All right, one of the big ethical issues is the use of deception in research. This is often used in research in social psychology. If I'm studying things like helping behavior, so I'm going to put people in a certain situation to see if they help another person. Or if I'm studying prejudice, I probably don't tell them the exact purpose of this study because if I do, they won't act naturally. And so I won't be able to tell, are they helping, the way they normally would, or are they only helping because they know the study is studying helping behavior? So sometimes researchers use deception so that they can actually study natural behavior of their participants, which they won't get if they don't use deception. But there's lots, before you use deception in research, you should consider the other side of this, the problems with using deception. From a moral or ethical issue, on the one end of the continuum, some argue that deception is never okay. And one of the arguments for that is that if you use deception, you truly can't get true informed consent from your participant, because they can't consent to things that if they don't know exactly what the study's about. I think that's a pretty conservative interpretation of informed consent. I don't think that's necessarily what's meant by it. But that's the one end, is that if you use deception, no one can be truly informed about what the research involves. Some have argued that in the informed consent form, we should just say things like, you might be deceived in the study. I don't necessarily like that, especially if my research doesn't involve deception. I don't want to put that in my informed consent, because then it's alerting people and raising suspicion when there's no reason to raise their suspicion. And then if you do only say, hey, this might involve deception, when the research does involve deception, once again, you're increasing the odds that the participant figures out the manipulation in the study and therefore may not act naturally. So that's one problem with deception. Another problem is that sometimes participants just assume that all research involves deception, which is not the case. A lot of research conducted in the psychology department doesn't involve deception. But if participants are all expecting deception, they may act a little bit differently than if they weren't expecting deception. So that's another potential problem, is that if we use too much deception, that participants always expect it. I think that's another problem. They may not act naturally. How do participants react to being deceived? So when we do use deception, once again, I think this goes back to debriefing. If you're respectful and you rationally explain why you had to use deception in your study, I think most participants are okay with it. There's a little bit of research that's been conducted on this, and once again, most participants are okay with the use of deception if there's a good reason for it. There's one study in particular where they ran the same study, and in one version they kind of told participants the truth, and in another version they used deception. And then during debriefing, they got the participants' responses to the research and had them rate how important they thought the research was. What they actually found is that the participants who were deceived thought the research was more important, because the deception was key to kind of studying that behavior. Whereas if you don't use deception in that area, the behavior isn't natural, and therefore that research is less important. So once again, if you do debriefing in a respectful way, I think most participants are okay with this. But you should always ask yourself, is deception absolutely necessary to run this research? One of the things that is kind of a pet peeve of mine is the assumption by some individuals that if research involves deception, it's automatically less moral or less ethical than research that doesn't involve deception. And I don't think that's necessarily the truth, or true. Some of the most unethical research studies in social psychology really didn't involve deception at all. If you're familiar with Zimbardo's prison study or the Stanford prison study, college students were recruited from the community to participate in this mock prison. They were either going to be assigned as a guard or a prisoner. So they knew exactly what the study was about. There was no deception involved. And it ended up being very unethical. First of all, Zimbardo should have shut the study down way earlier than he did. But basically, what happened is the prison guards, the college students assigned to the role of prison guards, were mistreating and badly mistreating the prisoners. And so, no real deception involved, but highly unethical because of the stress that the prison or the prisoners went through. Here's kind of a smaller version of the same idea that sometimes deception still results in unethical research. So this was a high school teacher. It's not an experiment. This is a great example where the use of the word experiment is not used accurately. They just mean study or demonstration in this case. The teacher told the high school students that we can't metabolize the acids in milk real fast. And that's why you can't drink a whole bunch of milk in a short period of time. And so all the students were told this. They know if they drink too much milk, they'll get sick because the body can't metabolize it. And he had milk there, and so a bunch of the students, this is pretty typical, you kind of egg each other on, and a bunch of students got sick. Okay, and parents got upset about this. Now, this research is unethical, and the primary problem here is that in order to do something like this with individuals who are under 18, and in some states under 19, you need parental consent. In other words, in addition to getting the high school students permission that, yeah, go ahead and drink the milk if you want to, you needed their parents' permission as well, since there was the possibility of them getting sick, or the likelihood if they drink enough milk. Okay, but this is unethical, but it didn't involve deception at all. In fact, the teacher told them exactly what was going to happen. So unethical stuff still happens even if you don't use deception. It's not like deception by default is worse than non-deceptive research. Okay, so the kind of we'll talk about misconduct in research, and then go over some writing tips and how to avoid plagiarism specifically. So, three big areas of misconduct for researchers: fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Fabrication is basically where you've collected real data, but in testing your hypotheses, something doesn't quite work out. And this is the big criticism of that magic p is less than 0.05. Because what happens if p is 0.052? Well, that's not that. I mean, that's not magically better in significant ways than 0.049. But we treat it as if it's completely different. And unfortunately, that often makes a difference in whether or not you can publish research or not, that magic 0.05. So if your data comes out and your p-value is 0.052 and you spend a year collecting this data, darn, it didn't work. Well, some researchers end up dropping participants in a way that helps their p-value or helps their hypotheses come out. That's unethical. You know, you want to drop outliers before you test your research hypotheses. That way you're not tempted to drop people in a way that helps your research hypotheses come out. So changing a data point here or there, or dropping outliers that you have no reason to drop, that's fabrication. Falsification is several steps further. It's just making the data up. You didn't really collect any data, you just made it up. So that's kind of the worst possible thing you can do, obviously. And then plagiarism. And you can plagiarize other people's work. What you also sometimes see in researchers, and this is actually sometimes a bigger problem, I think, is self-plagiarism, where you use a quote or a phrase or a paragraph that you've used before in another publication. And this might be conscious or unconscious. You might just figure, oh, I don't want to rewrite this from scratch. I'll just take this paragraph I already wrote for another publication. Or you might, because you've written it before, you might end up writing something almost the exact same because it just flows really easily. So it's kind of an unconscious plagiarism. They're both still wrong because even though you did the work in self-plagiarism, you're basically not doing any extra work. You're just taking something from an already published source and using it again. You can't do that. So talk about how bad of a problem each of these are. Swayze, Anderson, and Lewis conducted a study quite a while ago. More recent studies have found basically the same thing. They surveyed faculty and graduate students that conduct research, and they asked about these different things. And so, first of all, if you're asked about, hey, have you fabricated or falsified or plagiarized, you've already got this social desirability problem. Even if I've done those horrible things, I may not want to admit it, even on an anonymous survey. So you might expect that even though this is an anonymous survey, because this is bad behavior and we don't like admitting to bad behavior, regardless of what it is, the data that I'm going to give you now, or the results I'm going to give you, it might be an underestimate of how bad these things are, which is really scary. What Swayze and colleagues found is that 6 to 9% of faculty reported doing at least one of these things, which is frightening to me. That may seem like a small percentage, but that's way too high. Even more frightening is the fact that 10 to 20% of graduate students, so individuals who are potentially the next generation of faculty, are reporting doing these things. Once again, that's really frightening. And it's bad in multiple ways, obviously. It's cheating, it's wrong. But the big problem with this is it slows down science. The nice thing is science, it will self-correct eventually. So if someone fakes data, they make it up, and they publish research, what ends up happening is researchers end up wasting their time and resources. I come along, see that really cool result, and think, oh, I want to replicate that research and kind of test additional ideas based on that original published study. I might spend a couple years collecting data and testing hypotheses, and I can't replicate that original study before I give up. So I might spend 2-3 years of my time wasting my time trying to replicate a result that was faked in the first place. So it wastes my time, it wastes resources, and it's probably doing that to multiple researchers. So it slows science down. Eventually, it will come out that that data was falsified, or the fact that no one can replicate it, and then people will kind of forget about that result. But it takes time. Okay. And part of this, there is no justification for this, but I think one of the reasons for why this happens is this notion of publish or perish. You may have heard of this. It's this idea that faculty have to publish so many manuscripts a year or in a short period of time in order to keep their job. In different departments on campus, it's typically like 1 or 2 publications a year on average. And you can imagine if you get behind and you're not publishing a study or 2 each year, you might start to panic. And I think that's where this stuff starts. It might start with, dropping a few participants when you shouldn't, just to get that p-value below 0.05. And then eventually it might escalate into faking data altogether. And there's no justification for it, but I think part of it is this pressure to publish. Probably one of the worst cases of this in psychology, and he was a social psychologist, unfortunately. He was extremely popular. At his height, he was always the guy that was on the news being interviewed about his cool findings, and it was always these, counterintuitive findings that you're just like, wow, I can't believe that worked. Well, they didn't work because he started out fabricating data so that things would work. And then he went to full blown falsification, just faking his data. He always had huge grants. He had tons of grant money, would publish tons of research. Eventually, a couple of his graduate students started to notice some weird things about the data and turned him into the chair of his department, and that's how he got caught. I think in the end, they ended up retracting or removing between 40 and 50 of his publications. He was he just published a ton. And the bad part about this is that he got what he deserved. He lost his job. He was banned for applying for federal grants for I think like 5 years or so. And so that hurt him individually. The problem is it hurt those around him too. Stoppel, the way that his research lab worked, and it's different from the way most labs work, he would actually be the only one that had access to the data. So he would pretend to collect the data for other people, even for his graduate students, or his graduate students would collect the data and then he would just enter the fake data. So his graduate students and his collaborators, for the most part, didn't know he was faking the data. So now all their work and effort has kind of been cast under a shadow as well. And they lose publications when those publications get retracted as well. So he hurt a lot of other people, and just bad situation. The worst part of this is that he wrote a book about how he faked all this data, and that became a bestseller. So he ended up making a ton of money based on his bad behavior. Another person you might have heard of is Andrew Wakefield, and this is in the area of medicine. He conducted a very tiny study, I think it was based on 12 children, where he supposedly showed a correlation between getting a vaccination and developing autism. Okay. Now, if you've heard of this whole scare about parents not wanting to get their kids vaccinated because they're worried about autism, this is where it started. And the reason that this is so scary is because of all of the problems with this. First of all, the one problem, it wasn't even his issue, was he conducted a correlational study. Okay, it wasn't an experiment, it was a correlational study. The media blew this out of proportion and made a causal claim. The fact that so he's just showing an association, but they're jumping to a causal claim that getting vaccinations causes autism. Remember, when we go from correlation to causation, we shouldn't make that jump because of the directionality problem, because of the third variable problem. But the media made that jump. Okay, so parents all heard about this, and that would frighten you as a parent. Well, what the media didn't do a good job of covering is the fact that it was later discovered that he faked his data. Okay, so it's fake data. The other thing that everybody should have been concerned about and right away is the fact that it was such a small sample. And so when lots of other researchers ran out to replicate this finding based on huge data sets of children, they found no relationship whatsoever between vaccinations and getting autism. Okay, the media didn't do a great job of conveying that the data was faked or that subsequent huge replications failed. And because of the failure to get that information out there, we still have parents running around against vaccinations because they think that it's connected to autism when there is no connection. So Wakefield, this caused huge damage because we've got children out there who get these horrible diseases that could be prevented by vaccinations simply because of misinformation that's out there. So it slows down science. It has real life consequences for other researchers, for other people, especially if you're talking about medical research. It's just bad all the way around. The last type is plagiarism. Plagiarism, we shouldn't use substantial portions of other work, even if the other work or data source is cited occasionally. I think a lot of people think that they can, just take whole paragraphs from someone else's work, and as long as they cite it, that's okay. That's not okay. If you're not doing any of the work on your own or any of the writing on your own, it's still plagiarism. Several years ago, when I first started teaching, there was a colleague in another department who charged a student with plagiarism, and the student was shocked because the student had cited correctly. All the quotes that they had in their paper were cited correctly. The problem is that the entire paper was one quote after another. There was no original work by the student other than copying and pasting quotes into their paper. So that's still plagiarism. There has to be something unique that you're adding. And this is why it's really important to write everything in your own words. You still want to cite the source of the ideas or the evidence that you're using, but you want to write stuff in your own words. We're going to use a very strict definition of plagiarism in this class, which I'll go over on the next, in a subsequent slide. But it's so strict, I do that for a reason, to make it really obvious what is and isn't going to be plagiarism in this class. So, and it's not just researchers, students, faculty that can plagiarize. This is a case from 2016, Melania Trump's speech, which heavily plagiarized Michelle Obama's 2008 speech. And to some extent, probably shouldn't blame Melania, because rarely do these public officials write their own speeches. It's typically a speechwriter. So Melania Trump's speechwriter heavily plagiarized Michelle Obama. All right, so how are you going to avoid plagiarism in this class? First thing, we're going to use something called the rule of three. If you use 3 or more consecutive words from someone else's writing, and it could be another researcher, another author, it could be a group member. If you're working on a research project, you need to treat that as a direct quote, okay? And if you don't treat that as a direct quote, it's plagiarism. That's simple. All right, 3 or more consecutive words. Now, there's going to be some caveats and exceptions to that I'll mention throughout the semester. One exception is if you're discussing a theory. So if you're talking about social dominance theory or social dominance orientation, that's 3 words, but that's a common usage, that's a theory. So if it's the name of a theory that's 3 or more words, you don't have to treat that as a direct quote. And also, if you're working in a group on your research project, and you have to develop research hypotheses or predictions, some of your hypotheses might match a group member, some of them might be different, and that's fine. They don't have to match, but they can. If they match, it's okay if the hypotheses use the same wording. But other than those 2 reasons and some other things I'll mention during the semester, 3 consecutive words or more, you've got to treat it as a direct quote, okay? If you don't cite that as a direct quote correctly in APA style, we're counting that as plagiarism. So be aware of that. If you're going to do something like this, 3 or more words in a row, you've got to have 4 things to cite it correctly. Otherwise, it's plagiarism. You've got to put it in parentheses. You've got to include the author's last names, where you took it, the publication year of the article that you took it from, and then the page number. If you don't have those 4 things, it's plagiarism. So very cut and dry. The easiest way to avoid plagiarism, don't use direct quotes, and don't take 3 or more consecutive words from someone else's writing. To be honest, it's usually evidence of lazy writing. And what I mean by lazy writing is we often, and I do the same thing, and I used to do it a lot when I was an undergrad. I would use direct quotes if I didn't completely understand what the writer was saying. It's like, I don't know what you're trying to say here, so I'll just quote you, and then that's good enough. No, we're not doing that in here. you've got to understand what the researcher's saying so that you can write it in your own words. That may require you to read an article multiple times to kind of understand the main points, or read other articles related to it so that you understand the terminology and understand what's going on in these research articles. But that's the biggest thing. Just rewrite everything in your own words. You still have to cite the source of ideas, but that way at least you're not having to worry about the rule of three, and you're not having to worry about having those 4 pieces of information in direct quote if you rewrite everything in your own words. If you write everything in your own words, you still have to cite the source of the ideas, any evidence that you use or source of information, and that citation's much easier. Instead of remembering 4 things you have to do, like you do in a direct quote, you only have to do 2 things. You just need the last names of the authors and then the year of the publication. So 2 things when you're citing ideas. All right, so that's it for this discussion. Kind of talked about some of the historical events that led to current ethical guidelines. We talked about how organizations and universities try to protect ethics and participants' rights. We talked about deception a little bit, and then talked about the 3 big violations of ethics that researchers sometimes commit: fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Okay.